Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Omane Abu, and I work for the City of Glendale Water Services Department. Joining me tonight is Joanne Toms, who also works with the Water Services Department, and our guest speaker for tonight, Kirti Mathura. So the topic for tonight's class is desert-friendly landscapes for beginners. And so before diving in, we want to go over some webinar logistics. So all attendees are muted and the class will be recorded. The recording will be available on the city's water conservation website and YouTube channel in about a week. You can type your questions and comments in the Q&A or chat functions. I see some of you guys are already starting to use those, and Joanne and I will read and respond to as many as we can throughout the webinar. The class is scheduled to be about 1.5 hours long. We'll try to do about 1 hour 10 for the workshop and try to leave 15 to 20 minutes for questions. Again, there's a lot of us expected to attend tonight, so we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. But if we're not able to get to your question tonight, feel free to contact myself at the Water Conservation Office. And we also have some recordings on our YouTube channel as well, in case you want to dive into some deeper topics tonight that we didn't have enough time for. So again, there's resources available if we're not able to get to your question tonight. If you do experience any significant technical difficulties, you can contact Joanne Toms via email or phone. I see that she already included that in the chat. So her email is jtoms, T-O-M-S, @glendaleaz.com, or you can call her at 623-930-3596. And following this presentation, we'll follow up with an email that includes a copy of the PowerPoint, the resources, and a recording, and a link to the survey. So if you complete the survey, you'll be entered in for a chance to win a gift card from a local nursery. So we really value your feedback. So please help us understand what your needs are by completing that survey with us. And in case you're still new to Zoom or haven't been on before, maybe this is your first time, this is what your current view might resemble. So you can play around with the features so that you're comfortable. You can click and drag the vertical bar located in between the presenter and the presentation to enlarge or shrink the presentation view. And you can also adjust the audio settings in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Again, feel free to send comments using the chat button, or you can use the Q&A button as well. Again, Joanne and I will do our best to answer questions, but if there's a lot of questions coming through, feel free to reach out to us after the webinar, because we do want to assist you in any questions that you may have had during the presentation. And again, we'll have questions, time for questions at the end of the presentation as well. And so I wanted to highlight a few free publications that Kirti will be referring to for tonight's presentation. Direct links to these resources was included in the class reminder email. So the first is Landscape Plants for the Arizona Desert. This is a publication that has more than 200 low maintenance, water thrifty, and beautiful plants that thrive in Arizona. We also have Landscaping with Style in the Arizona Desert. This is a step-by-step guide about the design, installation, and how to care for your new low maintenance landscape. And lastly, we have Landscape Watering by the Numbers. This is a tool to help you determine how much water your plant needs to ensure they're healthy and beautiful. And you can access these guides and other publications online using the links on the slide, or Glendale residents can request to have a hard copy mailed by filling out the request form on the slide, or you can give us an email at greenliving@glendaleaz.com, or you can call 623-930-3553 to request your publications. And if you don't live in the city of Glendale, check with your water provider to see if they offer these publications as well. Well, that's enough of me chatting. So I'm really excited to introduce you all to our presenter tonight. So Kirti worked at the Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix in different capacities for over 17 years. And after serving 6 years as a garden volunteer, and she also worked as a horticulturist for Caesar Meiser Landscaping and Consulting in Sign Farms, and taught plant materials for the Landscape Architecture program at ASU School of Design. Most currently, she is the program coordinator for the Smartscape training with the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension and teaches landscaping and gardening workshops for several municipalities in the Phoenix area. She's involved in various local and national plant organizations and enjoys sharing gardening information in many different formats. Kirti authored the Arizona Low Desert Flower Garden, published by Gibbs Smith, and contributed to other landscaping and gardening publications. We are so excited to have Kirti join us tonight. Thank you so much, Kirti.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. And thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. Welcome. That was a great introduction. Thank you, Amine. I want to just share some information about plants and our environment here in the desert. I would imagine some or maybe even quite a few of you are transplants. I myself grew up gardening in Michigan. And when I moved out here to the desert, it was like a totally different world. But I embraced it, and there's so much beauty that we can enjoy by incorporating really desert appropriate plants, whether they're native plants or plants from other arid regions around the world. So when we're thinking of being water efficient, we're not by any means encouraging xeriscape. Definitely not. We don't want anybody to have this as a view in their front yard or their backyard. I mean, how sad is this? This was 3 houses in a row on a cul-de-sac, not a single plant in them. I just thought, to me, that's so depressing. We can have, through very conscientious xeriscaping, beautiful, comfortable, and water efficient settings that are just so enjoyable. So that's what I want to talk about this evening. So xeriscape follows 7 main principles. It was a concept that was developed in the Denver area back in the 80s, when they realized that even there, people needed to be thinking in terms of having landscapes that were water efficient, but yet enjoyable, beautiful, functional for home activities. And their 7 principles are starting with a good landscape design. If you're using turf, and a xeriscape can include turf, but if you're going to use it, make sure it has a use that, maybe people will be playing or, walking on it, whatever, or pets. But turf that's just there for an expansive green is not really part of a xeriscape. Efficient irrigation, which we're really going to spend some more time on, and Amine pointed out these fabulous publications that you have available to you. You can get a hard copy, but they're also available online. And online oftentimes is even better because there are different features that you can get that you aren't having with a hard copy. Soil improvements, generally for our desert plants, when we're using those most appropriate plants, we really don't have to worry about soil improvements. The uses of mulch is quite important in creating our xeriscape, and that could include what we most typically have in our desert landscapes, the inorganic rock, but even better would be to use an organic mulch. And finally, appropriate maintenance, which certainly involves not only proper watering, but surely proper pruning can impact the health and appearance of your xeriscape. And finally, I kind of went out of order, the plants. There are so many fabulous plants that are available to us in the landscape industry here in the Valley, and you can certainly explore them in the hard copy of this publication, or the online version has a search function that I think is very helpful. You also have more photos that you can get a better idea of just what these plants could offer in your landscape. So we can have settings like this that have so many different interesting textures and colors and forms. We can have areas that feel like an oasis, but they are still involving water efficient plants. We can have color year round depending on what we're using. And this is, I think, just a star to have color in your garden all through the year. That's a purple prickly pear. And we can have seasonal color that will come and go. And probably our biggest burst of color would be in the springtime, but with proper planning, you can have color available through each of the different seasons. We can have a setting like this that's primarily perennials that can offer color now and then through the year, with some stronger points of interest with the different succulent plants. And definitely our annual wildflowers can give you a great burst of color, explosion even, particularly in the springtime. That can be a lot of fun. So we don't have to go with a traditional landscape, which to me is, something like this is not at all thrilling, but we can have all these different colors and textures and fun with some very drought tolerant plants. We have so many benefits of using desert plants, whether they're native or desert adapted from another region. First off, they are just fine with our sun exposures, with our extreme temperatures, especially the high temperatures that they face here in the desert, and our soils. When I first moved here from Michigan and somebody was talking about the soil, I just kind of was looking under my feet and I thought, what soil? I was used to soil being something really dark and very organically rich and had an earthy aroma to it. But this soil is what these plants have evolved with, and they thrive with the soil conditions. They've been doing this, having this association for thousands and thousands of years, and they've been very successful. Whereas when we try to bring in other plants, gardenias and things like that, they're not at all compatible with our soil. So taking a look at some adaptations some of our desert plants exhibit to help them just be robust and vigorous and thrive in the desert. A lot of our plants have a reduced leaf surface. When we look at something like our native blue Palo Verde and little leaf Palo Verde, oh my gosh, this is taking leaf reduction to an extreme. It's just amazing. But leaves have pores that are open primarily during sunlight, and those pores allow carbon dioxide to be taken in by the plant tissue, and that's utilized in the photosynthesis process. Well, moisture can also trickle out into the atmosphere through these open pores. If you have a smaller leaf surface, you have fewer pores, and you therefore reduce the amount of moisture you're losing to the air through the process we call transpiration. So this is why we see so many of our plants having that reduced leaf size. It's of great benefit. Some of our desert plants have the ability, when we're progressing into a period of drought and there's just not sufficient moisture in the soil, the plants just start throwing off their leaves. They drop those leaves, and our native ocotillo can go through this cycle during the summer a few or multiple times, where it will drop its leaves. When moisture is available, it will slurp it up. You can actually listen to the roots and they're slurping. Okay, if anybody tries that, let me know if you hear it. But they absorb that moisture, any little bits of moisture that we receive in the soil, and a whole new flush of foliage will develop. It may seem kind of crazy that, the plants, expending a lot of energy in producing new foliage, but in the balance, these plants have a better chance of thriving by going through this process. Even some of our trees and other plants, shrubs and things, if they're out in the desert and they're going through extended drought periods, they too would drop their leaves for a period until moisture is again available. We have our native Palo Verde trees, which have the green bark. This green bark allows them to photosynthesize, not at the capacity that would occur if the foliage, if it was covered with foliage, but it can still carry on that process of creating some food products to keep itself going. The other interesting adaptation is so many of our desert plants have some kind of protection on their leaf surface. And that might be something that we see very often, giving some of our desert plants that silvery green color to the foliage. The foliage might be covered with hairs, and sometimes they're very fine and a mass, such as we see with our desert marigold, lovely perennial plant, or it might be just very short hair, might even be stiff, giving the plant a rough texture, the leaves a rough texture, but that's like a sunscreen. It's a break in the sun rays directly hitting the surface of the leaf. So it can keep them cooler, can also help slow down that rate of loss of moisture. Our wonderful creosote, if you've noticed the aroma in the air when we have some rain, that comes from these resins that are in the tissue, the leaf tissue. So there's almost a resinous coating on the leaf tissue that gives it a little buffer from the sun and protects it. And that's what we smell when we have some rain. It's like it wakes up that chemistry found in the creosote leaves. Some plants have the ability to store moisture in their tissues when it's available. We have so many different succulent plants. We refer to them as succulents. Some of them are leaf succulents, and that's very evident with our different aloe plants. There are also things like our ice plants. We have so many different wonderful ground covers that fall into this kind of broad group of ice plants. The leaves on these plants also are very thick and fleshy. So the plant takes up all this moisture that's available in the soil when we have a good rain or you provide irrigation, and it can store it in these tissues as a reserve for later on if things get dry for an extended period. We also have stem succulents. Our cacti are considered stem succulents. It might be easier to envision that concept of a stem succulent if you think about a saguaro, but our prickly pears are also stem succulents because these pads are modified stem segments with our prickly pears. Same with the choyas, those cane segments are modified stems. There are a few, not too many, but a few the root succulents that we also have here in the desert. This is the Arizona Queen of the Night. It is just an incredible plant that most of the year above ground, it just might appear as dead sticks until around late June, early July. At night, these exquisitely, enchantingly scented blooms open. Then you definitely would notice them. So although it appears as maybe just sticks above ground, what's underground is this tuberous tissue, and this tuber will continue to enlarge year after year as this plant grows and ages, and it's got a great capacity to store moisture. So those are our succulent plants. And these plants, they are just typically, we have so many typically low water use plants that we can choose from. I mentioned we have so many different forms and colors and textures. I mean, it's just, to me, mind-boggling, the choices that we have to include plants in our landscapes. So with our desert plants also, I would say they just can offer so much beauty. I mentioned before that the prickly pear that has these purplish pads, the color's more pronounced in the winter with the cold temperatures, and sometimes in the summer in response to heat stress, but also blooms on cacti are exquisite. I'd say these blooms rival any rose blossom. Some of them are extremely fragrant, others not. But I just think, if you take a minute to really enjoy the attributes of these plants, you wouldn't be pining for your plants from another region so much. When we really explore attributes of some of our plants and we very carefully, strategically place them in the landscape, you will have different features, come to life at different times of the day. Some of our plants, if they're backlit by the sun early morning or late afternoon, evening, they are just aglow, glistening, just incredible in their spination being featured, or blooms of different perennial bunch grasses that are showy. Some of our plants might have this incredible margin that midday, okay, that's kind of pretty, but when the blight's behind them, it's like, wow. So there are incredible aspects of our plants that we can really enjoy. And I think really a great benefit of using our desert plants is that they're generally just about as low maintenance as you can get. They are typically drought tolerant. They have very low fertilizer needs, if any. And certainly if you're of the mind to not always be cleaning up every little leaf that falls to the ground, and you let some of that foliage kind of cycle back into the soil, then you really don't need to use fertilizer for our desert plants. And if we're not overwatering, we're not over fertilizing, generally there's very little pruning associated with these plants. One thing that I really like also, especially if we can incorporate some native plants, they really provide resources for our native wildlife, whether it be food, as we see examples here. Oh, this just cracked me up when I saw this little squirrel. How did they reach all the way across that spiny cactus and not get poked? But in other cases, our native plants might offer shelter or nesting sites. Our native verdin, which isn't much larger than a hummingbird, has a very interesting nest that's kind of egg-shaped with a small opening that's either kind of at the side or maybe sometimes even angled down. Talk about secure. But they most often will build their nest in a native blue Palo Verde or an ironwood, one of our native trees. It's not, very often all that I don't think I've ever seen one built in a non-native desert tree. And sometimes, plants can help, such as with the monarch. They can help this creature complete its entire life cycle. With the flowers, you have nectar for the adult. The adult will lay eggs, and the caterpillars will feed upon the plant to grow and then turn into a pupa or the chrysalis. And then when they emerge, that whole life cycle is completed right there on a milkweed. So let's take a look. Well, I grew up in Michigan, as I said, and hostas were very popular there. And if you had a woodland setting, you might include ferns. So I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make when we're moving to our desert region is, although we tend towards familiarity, And even though, to my disappointment, there are some nurseries that will try to sell you these plants, we just need to look for similar plants that can offer us the same textures and colors and so forth, same form, the same feel, but they're lower water use and more compatible overall with our environment. And, for just about anything, there is an equivalent that we could find that is desert appropriate. Some people have the misconception that, oh, it's a desert plant, so it doesn't need water. That is so untrue. We have to offer water to our plants at least for the first summer to help get a root system established. Plants cannot make it through brutal summers if they do not have a good, healthy root system. So for perennials, might take a year to get a good root system developed. Shrubs, it might take 2 or 3 years, depending on how large they would reach, what size they'd reach at maturity. And trees, you could mostly count on 3 to 5 years for getting a full, robust root system developed that will hold that tree steady in any kind of wind and just overall support that tree canopy above ground in a healthy way. Even mature plants, once you get them established, if we have extended periods of dryness, we would need to provide them with some supplemental water source. This is a beautiful cow's horn agave, and it just has this almost kind of sensual curve to the leaves. Well, this is the same plant, and it went through a period a little too long of a stretch between waterings, and the leaves changed orientation to help this plant survive. If you're at an angle, the sun will hit you longer and more strongly than if you're vertical. You're going to have less of your leaf surface hit directly by the sun rays through the cycle of a day. So once this plant gets a good watering out where the roots are absorbing water, it would then revert back to that nice open, lovely curved leaf form. And prickly pears, they will let you know. So as succulents, they can absorb moisture when it's available and those pads are all plump. But when the soil gets drier, then that plant will start using up those reserves of moisture, and you'll start to see maybe a wrinkling, or from a side view, it kind of looks like that pad's, emaciated. And these are signs, hey, I need some water. This got so bad, this prickly pear pad connected, where the connection is, it just kind of flopped because there wasn't enough turgor in the system to support that. Even some fruits started just kind of drooping on the plant. So we need to look for these things. I would say that most of us are more used to seeing the signals on a traditional leafy plant. The leaves start to get a little droopy. Oh, that plant needs water. But our succulents will also let us know when they need water. Another misconception is that, every desert plant loves to have the sun just beating on them all day, every day. Not true. If we go out rambling in the desert, we will find that some plants will actually be kind of tucked under another plant to give it a little break, break in the sun exposure. So in this setting where there aren't any trees, there's no building to really cast any kind of shade on these plants through the cycle of the day at any time of year, these are tough plants. They have to be to make it in that environment. What happens when these succulent desert plants are receiving too much direct sun is they will start to discolor. Initially, from whatever the normal green is, whether it's a yellow green or blue green, dark green, whatever, gray green, the tissue will start to yellow. This would be like us being out in the sun too long and we start to get a little pink. So if we pay attention to that yellowing, discoloration of the tissue, and we either, give the plant some shade midday or afternoon if possible, or even if possible, if it was a newly installed plant, maybe it's better to move it to a different location. Some plants, once they get established and their root system is real robust, can take more sun. But if you suddenly realize, oh, I made a mistake, this agave shouldn't be in full sun, or this aloe shouldn't be in full sun, if you can move it, that would be even better. But with these plants, if you disregard that signal, what will then happen is the tissue will turn to a white color, and that is sunburn, what we see here. So following that, the tissue would turn from white to tan and finally just a brown color. And that would be like us getting severely burned, and peeling. We want to avoid this. On succulent plants, most often with the succulents, these leaves or pads are going to be with that plant for years, if not for their entire life. And to have it maybe even just cosmetically damaged like this, that's going to be a part of that plant for as long as that leaf is present, which, as I say, could be its entire life. So we need to look for these signals. I remember thinking, moving to the desert, oh, it's not going to get cold. Well, definitely in the last decade, last 15 years or so, we have had some substantial freeze episodes here in the valley. We do need to pay attention to low temperatures as well as high temperature tolerance. With some of our plants, many of our native plants, they're fine with our low temperatures, even with extreme freezes, but plants that are from elsewhere may not fare as well. This is a lovely, very people-friendly agave, the smooth leaf agave. It is very susceptible to freeze damage. We can see these leaves, the browning, that is permanent damage. That tissue froze and those leaves are going to be looking bad forever. This is a succulent from Africa. We see damage on the leaves, and I'd say even some of the stem tissue is dead, got frozen, but you do see good tissue underneath. So something like this, you could, once the danger of frost has passed, at the end of the winter season, beginning of spring, you could prune this off, and this will be generating new stems and leaves, but it's not as if they're just going to every year throw their leaves off. So just be aware of that and know the cold hardiness of the plants, and be aware of, in all of our gardens, all of our yards, we have little microclimates where there's, maybe a corner of the yard that gets colder during the winter, and try to place your plants appropriately. This is a yellow bells, something leafy like this. It looks like the leaves are literally burned. And what we want to do is, of course, leave this as a buffer for any later freeze episodes to protect this still vibrant tissue below. So let's talk about watering. This is just so critical, particularly here in our desert environment. What we want to strive for is giving good deep waterings. But once our plants are established, those watering cycles will be infrequent. And you have some wonderful publications. On the handout, at the very end of the handout, there's some information for the Maricopa County Cooperative Extension. You can go to the website and find so many very, very helpful publications on all topics of gardening and landscaping and so forth, turf things that would be available to you to download on your internet. And this is a great one to kind of give you an idea of the design and functioning of a drip irrigation system if you're not very familiar with that. Once we install plants into our landscape, for the leafy plants, we want to water them right away to reduce, minimize the stress that these plants will undergo. And we want to keep the soil moist for usually a couple of weeks. After that, and that doesn't mean soggy wet, just moist. After that, you want to get into a schedule that's appropriate for new plantings at that time of the year. And on that Landscape Watering by the Numbers publication, you can find helpful information such as this: watering schedule for newly planted desert adapted plants. And this will give you an idea of how you'd be watering to get your plants establishing. We have to be familiar with our soil conditions here in the, and yet, yes, this pale stuff, that is soil, that's topsoil. For you Midwesterners or people gardening in other areas that you're used to that rich soil, organically rich soil. We need to become familiar with the texture of the soil in our landscape and also the drainage. That's going to help us know how to water. It's always recommended to do a drainage test. That would involve digging a hole about a foot deep, foot wide, fill that hole with water. Let that drain. Once it drains, refill it. Then you want to start the clock ticking. If that test hole has not drained in 24 hours, you've definitely got a drainage problem. If it drains rather quickly, you've got great drainage, probably a sandy soil even, but you do want to get familiar with the texture of your soil and how it's going to drain. So with our soil textures, can range from clay that's comprised of very, very fine particles. They can get really compacted. The other extreme would be sandy soil with big particles and big spaces, big pore spaces between the particles. The happy medium would be a loam soil comprised of particle sizes ranging from minute to the large sandy size. And that's probably the best all around, the Goldilocks, that you can grow so many things. They'd be happy in a loamy soil. Whereas if you have the extreme, either sand or clay, you really have to be conscientious about the plants you choose and also your watering practices, your watering schedule. To look at the different soil textures and how water moves through them, this is just a real kind of gross generalization. If we were to apply a gallon of water to our soil, if it's a clay, the water will very slowly penetrate into the soil. It will spread wider than it will percolate deep. Sandy soil, it's so loose, pore spaces are large in between the particles, and the water just seems to very rapidly shoot straight down. So in between, the loamy soil, pretty much the moisture will travel about as deep as it does wide. So this might help you kind of visualize how that moisture is moving through the soil to help you in, especially considering if you're using drip emitters, how many drip emitters do you need? How long do I need to run the irrigation? This all comes into play being impacted by your soil type. With clay, you water, and once you finally get the water to percolate into the soil, it's going to remain available to the plants for a longer period of time. So it may take a long time to get water to percolate 2 or 3 feet deep, but once you've applied that water, you've got usually a long period before you need to water again. Sandy soil, you're going to have to use multiple emitters to make sure the root system gets water in, all around the plant, and you'll have to water much more frequently because that water shoots down. It will evaporate out of the soil more rapidly. It'll shoot down below the root zone more rapidly, so you'd have to water more often. This is also from your landscape watering by the numbers publication, a great visual. Overall, if you're working with perennial plants or ground covers or succulent plants, these generally have very shallow roots that don't go more than about a foot deep. So when we apply water, we want to make sure that for the mature plant roots, that the water will penetrate about a foot or a little more than a foot. Most of our desert shrubs develop root systems that will reach about 2 feet deep into the soil. So we're going to apply our water so it goes about 2 feet or a little bit more into the soil. Our desert trees, the primary absorbing roots will be found within the top 2 to 3 feet of the soil. So if we're watering so that the water will go 6 feet deep, that's a gross waste of water. Our tree roots just generally don't go that deep. If a mesquite tree or a Palo Verde, if it is planted by seed, it may develop a taproot, but the bulk of absorbing roots as that tree matures will be in that upper profile between 2 and 3 feet deep. So a great way to find out how deep your moisture is getting. Do you need to water longer? Did you really overwater? So you should maybe cut the watering time in half next time. Good way to figure that out is to use a soil probe. This, you can get these, and most often they're 3 feet in length. And this, my gardening friend got fancy and she painted, the feet different colors. The concept is after you water about, half an hour later, start to poke around. Be careful that you're not poking through your irrigation tubes, but poke around in a couple of places, a few places. Just that's to make sure that you're not getting tricked by hitting a rock. The probe will move easily through moistened soil, and you will definitely notice a difference in the ease of pushing it through the soil when you hit dry soil. So you eyeball where it stopped, pull that back out, and then you can measure how deep that moisture went. You have to have separate valves for watering your different types of plants, because not only are we going to be watering to different depths for a cactus or a desert shrub or a desert tree, they also will have different schedules to make sure that we are watering everything as best we can. We want to have a valve available for the perennials and ground covers. We want to have a valve for the desert shrubs. You might piggyback on that desert shrubs valve, perhaps maybe some agaves or aloes. And we want to have a line for our desert trees. You might piggyback some of our more drought tolerant native cactus on that same line. Pardon me. If you have turf, you've got to have another valve. If you have a veggie garden, you've got to have another valve for that. This will ensure that everybody gets watered the way they need to receive that water. It may seem like, oh my gosh, paying for 5 valves, 6 valves, whatever. It may sound absurd, but you will save so much money in having healthy plants that are watered properly long term. And with a drip irrigation system, from those valves, you'll have the poly tube that will run maybe through the perimeter of your yard or across here and there, and then that narrow spaghetti tube, which delivers the water directly to your plant. Now, it's important to understand that the tree root system, generally, if it were to grow out in nature, it will generally grow, 1.5 times, even up to 3 times as wide as the actual tree canopy. It's extending out further, much further than that tree canopy. It's important to know that you want to be delivering as this tree, starting from a little tree to growing, finally having this canopy. We want to keep moving water delivery out in sync with the canopy edge, because that's where the more absorbing roots will be found. The roots that had developed way back here, they're starting to just be stabilizers, anchoring the tree in the ground, and they're not really absorbing moisture or nutrients as this tree develops. That is occurring way out here or even extending further, especially if there is moisture available out here. That's so important to remember. So from a young tree to a developing tree, you're going to add emitters and move them further out from the base of that tree to meet the absorbing roots. Big, huge mistake. This is a big mature tree, and it's for its entire life. It's just had emitters right here at the trunk. That is not developing a robust root system. And a tree like this is one that it's not going to have the roots strongly anchoring it as it should. And this is the type of situation that would be more apt to just go boom in a big wind. So not only the trees, but some of the shrubs that tend to get larger, we want to do the same thing. Initially, this shrub would have had water just here at the base, but emitters have been moved out further and adding on additional emitters. And my buddy Jeff Lee refers to this, a great way to approach this is to use a J loop. What you'll do is you'll have emitters from this 1/2-inch poly tubing. You'll have emitters come towards the base of your young tree, and maybe the second year you will clip these spaghetti tubes and have your emitters out here to meet that new growth. And eventually you might even put goof plugs on these lines and insert spaghetti tubing that would be extending outside of that J loop then to meet that canopy edge. And here, this isn't completed. It's not, the emitters aren't set in place, but just so you can get a rough idea of this poly tube coming around. It started back here, comes around, and you've got these emitters that will be close to the base of this newly planted tree. And as time goes by, you move those emitters out, and then eventually they're going to be on this side of that poly tubing. If you're not using drip irrigation and you're using tree wells, you want to make sure that you keep moving this kind of donut shape structure here that's just a little bit lower than the natural grade. You want to keep moving that out, and you're going to be using, you have extra soil that will create this berm to hold water. So if you put the hose over here, it will hold this water. You're going to let it run for a good long while, and just let that water seep slowly into the soil. And especially if you're using citrus or other fruits, what you want to do is make sure that you have at least once a year or a couple times a year, add a fresh layer of organic mulch out away from the base of the tree to help hold moisture. We always recommend with your drip system that you use pressure compensating emitters. This will ensure if you have a 200-foot length of poly tubing, this will ensure that if you have several emitters on that tubing, each emitter will be providing the marked amount of water, whether this one's ½ gallon an hour, 2 gallon an hour, it will be providing the same amount of water here near this to the valve as it does way down 200 feet away. If they're not pressure compensating, usually you have more flow, higher flow from the emitters closest to the valve. And by the time you get 200 feet away, it's just like this little feeble, every once in a while, drip, drip. So your plants aren't receiving the amount of water you're thinking that they're receiving. So pressure compensating. You want to adjust your water schedule through the seasons, definitely. And also with the maturity of your plants. So year by year, as plants mature, you will water less frequently. We always leave once the roots get mature, we want to leave the length of time that the plants get water, because we know how deep that water's going. And the only thing will change is how frequently we water. So that's as the plants mature, after they've attained mature size, but also with the change of seasons. And when needed, we want to use what we call a cycle and soak setup to prevent runoff. And that's what we look for in these, having more than one start time for the system to turn on. And with this publication, from the newly planted desert adapted plants to scheduling, then we transitioned into the second year, and then you would keep extrapolating from there. So we need to know the texture of our soil and the drainage. And also if you have any kind of slope terrain. So if we have a clay soil or the drainage is just overall in general slow, or you have slopes, then it's important to, if you're needing to water 3 hours, then what you're going to do is cut it into 3. 1 hour, the system shuts off for a while, 1 hour, system shuts off again, and then 1 hour. So it allows that water some time to soak into the soil rather than just running off if you were running the system for 3 hours straight. Definitely, if we get good rain, turn your system off for a cycle, or maybe even more depending on how much water we get. This is a great system that you can easily use. You could text to 33222 when to water. With that, you will get an initial welcome text message. And after that, the first of every month, you'll get a little reminder message about the season. Check your irrigation controller, and it'll give you a link to the website where you can see the recommended scheduling for that particular month. You will not get bombarded with text messages. After the welcome message is just one reminder at the start of the month. And this can be very helpful. You definitely need to change the schedule seasonally on your controller, but even better would be to change it monthly, keeping up with the temperatures and the changing of the environment. We definitely need to look for leaks in our irrigation system and also clogs. You don't want to lose a plant because it's not receiving water because that emitter clogged somehow. And if you've got turf, same thing. We need to look for these mishaps with the system so that, number one, we're not wasting water, but this means that some of this turf isn't getting any water. Even if your system is not running and you have a big leak, such as in the polytube, there will be visual evidence. Usually finer soil will come to the surface. And as I say, even if the system isn't running, if you see something like this, you know you have a leak. Rainwater, we need to take advantage of that. And you can contour the soil in your lawn, in your yard, to help that rainwater slowly penetrate into the soil. So this will, careful contouring and grading, it will allow for water to be kind of directed to an area that it would be of great benefit, and it will slowly settle in or soak into the ground and be a great source of moisture for your plants. This was a great example. These folks decided they wanted to get rid of their turf, and oh my gosh, what a difference. They did major contouring and had just a wonderful planting of a shade canopy and other interesting desert plants in their yard, very successfully, almost primarily surviving on rainfall alone. These plants were not receiving irrigation. They were installed in 2003. They weren't receiving any irrigation. They were just vigorous, vibrant, great looking until, as I say, they were installed in 2003. And then by 2018, they started looking really, dropping most of the foliage, looking sad. And actually, this was at a friend's house, and it had been so many years from 2003 to 2018, I had totally forgotten there was no irrigation to these plants. What we did is we pulled the hose out and just set this on a slow trickle that provided water around, out towards the perimeter of the plant, just a slow, trickle. And this plant just, from looking like this in August, here in September, it's rebounded. So it is evident that we have been getting drier, because this never happened before since 2003. But it just shows you how tough and resilient these desert plants can be. Some areas receive flood irrigation, and that's great for some of our desert plants, but definitely not all of them. And this is just super overwatering in a turf. It's not flood irrigation. When we overwater, what happens is we make nutrients unavailable to plants, and they will often be discolored because of that. And we're reducing the functioning of their root systems. They can't carry on respiration properly. When we water frequently and very shallowly, what can happen is we can have a super buildup of minerals, of salts on the surface of the soil. You can see this white crustiness. These are the minerals that are accumulating. So this is extreme when we have frequent shallow waterings, but also keep in mind, when we're always watering for the same length of time, once or twice a year, you need to run your irrigation system, maybe even 2 cycles, to flush these minerals that are accumulating just below the root zone, to flush them down so that they won't be creating problems for the root system of your plants. Keep in mind, there are some plants that go dormant during the season, some of them even during the summer. So we do not want to overwater when they are taking a rest, we will risk rotting them. Overall, we don't recommend that trees go into turf areas, but if they do, make sure you carefully select the trees that would be most likely to be compatible, and always leave a buffer about 3-foot radius that's covered with mulch, so that you don't have the root systems of the tree right there competing with the turf. And also it's a buffer so that you won't damage the tree trunk with those string trimmers. And remember, keep an eye out, look for signals when our succulents are needing some water. They will tell us. We just have to be paying attention. So mulching is a great way to help conserve, hold moisture into the soil longer. So we're reducing the rate of evaporation. It can also cut down dust and help reduce the germination of weed seeds. We want to apply our mulch at least a good 2 inches deep to be effective, especially for reducing weed germination. And eventually, when we use organic mulch, generally, eventually, it will be broken down by microorganisms and eventually become part of the soil. This would be our natural cycle of leaves falling to the ground in the desert and being decomposed and then being incorporated into the soil. Do not ever cover your landscape with plastic. You're going to not have any benefit from a good rain, but it will also diminish the amount of air getting into the soil. The plant roots need air to carry on respiration and all of their activity. Also, there are very beneficial microorganisms in the soil. When we cover it with plastic, we're basically going to be, suffocating those poor little microorganisms. And I do not even recommend weed fabric. We're going to cover that with some kind of mulch. And after just a year or two, you'll have so much dust and debris accumulating that the weed seeds are just going to germinate on top of the weed fabric. Also, if the layer of the mulch on top of it isn't thick enough, it just looks hideous when all of that weed fabric starts showing there in the landscape. So pruning is so involved, whether it's, pruning trees, that's a whole nother class in itself. Pruning shrubs, a whole nother class. You can find online with the Glendale system videos that can help you. But I'm just going to quickly run through some of the main principles. The thing I really want you to always consider is that any foliage that is on a plant is it's providing photosynthesis and food production for the plant. Anytime we remove foliage from a plant, we are reducing its capacity to create its own food that is supporting the whole system above ground as well as the roots below ground. Always, always think of that every time you're thinking of removing some green foliage, whether it be a succulent, the agave leaves, or shrubs or trees. If possible, when you are newly installing trees and there are lower branches, leave those. Those leaves on those lower branches will be producing food that will most directly go to the base of that tree. So you will be having a sturdier, more vigorous base of your tree, the tree trunk, develop. If you strip all those lower branches off, it's going to be slower for that trunk to really get a good girth on it and be strong. So you need a reason to prune. with our trees, look for crossing branches or damaged or diseased branches or dead branches. That would be a reason to get out a pruning tool. And definitely also, we want to be safe. We want to have our structures nearby a tree not receive damage. If there's activity in the area, we need to, allow for people to be moving around and so forth. And definitely if your tree is in the front property and it might be impeding, or a shrub impeding vision to a stop sign or a corner for safety, these are reasons to prune. But just pruning to prune, not right. Always remember, for trees, we want to use what is called a 3-cut method, by cutting underneath the branch that we're going to remove, and then a second cut out a little bit further from that first cut. All the weight of that branch will be gone. So you can go in then and make your actual final pruning cut. If you don't do this, very often what happens is the weight of this branch, you start, sawing through here, and before you get to the other side, usually what happens is this weight swings down and it usually rips this bark back, creating a big wound. 3-cut method will avoid that wound. And we always want to avoid these types of great damages. And we don't use chainsaws to prune branches, because usually that chainsaw doesn't stop until it hits another branch and causes wounding. And we don't want to top trees. That causes all these multitudes of weakly attached sprouts to develop. And it's just a mess, and it's a hazard, definitely. This is becoming too prevalent in the valley. We call this lion's tailing, where we strip all the smaller branches, just leaving way out at the ends of these branches, main branches, just leaving small branches out here. This does not make our trees windproof. In fact, it makes them more susceptible to wind damage. Because of the physics, you will have so much, the wind will catch the outer portion of these big branches, and you'll have these branches whipping around more than if you had left a full growth of these smaller branches that would distribute the wind more evenly. Also, you're going to encourage sunburn or sun scald of these exposed branches. So just do not do this. Do not pay to have somebody do this. And you get no shade. Why have a tree? So this is definitely not appropriate. If you're going to kind of, reduce the crown or open up for, for airflow, you start at the tips and, gently remove from the outer portion in. You don't strip everything up. And this is, I hope none of you who are watching this find this attractive. This is just insane. To me, it's an eyesore. And to me, it's also a waste of water. These poor plants, they've been abused. They need even more water to try to, recuperate. And to, what end? So no topping, please, and no shearing of trees into lollipops or other weird shapes. And basically, when we're removing all of this tissue, if we're over pruning our trees or shearing our shrubs, we're weakening them, decreasing their life. So we can, create a hedge with some pruning, There are some plants that are amenable to this, but we don't want to be constantly shearing them. And in this example, they have these hop bush plants spaced widely enough that they will eventually at maturity just be this nice full screen, but not overplanted. And they wouldn't require, because they have plenty of room between the house and then room between them and the sidewalk, that they're not going to be creating any hazard to the structure. When you're working with shrubs, you want to approach the pruning, a selective pruning, that you really wouldn't even know that you have been pruning when you get finished, because your shrub will still be looking very natural, but it can be smaller. If we took this shrub and removed all of these parts that you see with the dotted lines, we could effectively reduce maybe a 6-foot shrub to 4 to 5 feet using this method. And you'd make cuts going, into different levels of this shrub. As I say, you have a very natural looking form, but it's smaller. When we do prune, we do not want to leave what we call stubs. We want to, with nice, clean, sharp hand pruners or loppers, we want to cut just above this node section. That node on the stem is a point of growth where the leaves and maybe flower development or newly developing branches are located. So just above the node, about 1/4 of an inch. And if you leave too much space, what will happen is this will just dry up, die back. That would be a good entry point for, you can see how this is dried up. Good entry point for diseases or insects. For your shrubs, spring bloomers, we want to trim them back if needed at the end of their bloom season. Something like these fabulous Aromophilus, which can be blooming from January or February through March and April, usually into May, sometimes even later. Most likely we would want to approach them for pruning during May at the end of their bloom cycle. The reason being is they start producing the flower buds. They start producing the flower buds last October or November. So if we're pruning them at, anytime during the fall or winter, we would be removing those flower buds, and that would mean no bloom for that season. When we're working with shrubs that bloom during the summer or fall, best time usually is late winter or early summer, as they're just starting to produce new growth. Our summer and fall bloomers generally produce their flowers on new growth of the season, not last season's growth. It's very common for something like our bird of paradise shrubs to give them a hard pruning back to about 1 foot during the winter season. Dead branches can be removed at any time, but just make sure you know the difference between dead branches and dormant branches. Some pruning is just cosmetic. There is no need to remove those spent bloom stems on something like the brittle bush. But if you like things looking a little tidier, it's certainly appropriate to remove them. And you might even think of it as meditative gardening, where you can go out with your hand clippers and just, clip those back. You could do maybe a faster pruning with some loppers and, trimming back the branch tips a little bit, but it's not necessary. Through the season, they will be weathering, and then they'll just blow off eventually. So we want to remember, I like to say shrubs are not sheep, so don't shear them, because especially in this case, February or March, if you start shearing these Valentine emus, you're losing most of the brilliant color that could be present even through April and May. with the sennas, the Australian sennas, sharing those, that is fabulous bloom that you could be enjoying, very fragrant and sweet smelling also. And the fairy duster, our pink fairy duster is so small anyway, why would you need to mess with it? The little leaf cordeates, tough as nails, a great large scale shrub, good background shrub. And for a shrub that would normally get 6 to 8 feet tall, I think it's absurd that it's made into a 2 foot tall, 3 foot wide biscuit in front of McDonald's. Here we have these lovely red yuccas. It just kills me. These are both on street medians. These plants with the foliage, they don't get any taller than 2 to 3 feet. So it's not a visibility issue. Even when they're full of bloom, you can see right through those. So to me, it's absurd that anybody, even on street medians, would mutilate these plants in such a way. They're not grasses. They don't just grow new leaves every year. And even at that, that's not the right way to prune your grasses back. Remember that the leaves are producing food for an entire plant. Having these agaves here in a 2 foot wide stretch of bed, these agaves want to mature to a size of 6 to 7 feet tall and wide. This is the same type of agave here. So wise location. And I guess this one, I can see why they had to, cut leaves off of this one, but they still overdid it. But I guess they decided this one had to match. So they've greatly reduced. That's not even a quarter of the foliage that should be photosynthesizing and feeding these poor plants. Now with fertilizing, in the desert, as I mentioned, even though these leaves are very small, on the mesquite tree, the Palo Verde, the brittle bush, they will drop to the ground through the cycle of a year, and they will decompose. They will be, acted upon by microorganisms and become part of the soil. Our desert soil very often has only about 1% organic matter versus 5% or maybe a little bit more in more fertile soils. But there is that cycle that continues. When we manipulate our environment in our urban landscapes and continually blow away, send to the landfill every single leaf that falls, we are stopping that cycle. So gradually over the years, we are basically killing our soil. There's nothing left for helpful, beneficial microorganisms to exist upon. So that's when we start to have to fertilize. Fertilizers that we apply are not the same as the chemistry of having the organic material filter and become part of the soil, and that supporting microorganism component of our soils. So if we are, to me, more rationally approaching the care of our landscape, there wouldn't be a need for fertilizer for any of our desert plants. If there is the need, though, we want to, definitely go with moderation, particularly with the nitrogen. Nitrogen promotes vegetative growth of our plants, and if we provide too much nitrogen, then we're forcing unnatural vegetative development, which has to be supported by providing more water. And then that usually necessitates more pruning. Pruning will stimulate growth. So you get into this horrible cycle. looking at nutrient availability in our soil, it is greatly impacted by the pH of our soil. In the desert, many of us have within our landscapes a pH of near 8 or sometimes even higher than 8. Some areas pretty extreme up to 8.5 on this pH scale. Plants that are not native to our desert environment or arid region from another area, they are seriously impacted with the pH related availability or non-availability of these nutrients. So these nutrients are in the soil, but when the pH gets way, extreme, they are tied up chemically so that the plant root system can't absorb them. And we really see this when we get up over 8, pH of 8, the availability of nitrogen starts to decline. Phosphorus really drops off. Overall, for most plants, we have sufficient potassium in our soil, but iron. So many plants that are not from desert regions, they're from more temperate or even tropical regions, they're severely impacted by the lower availability of iron and even calcium or magnesium. So keep that in mind. And this is why we shouldn't be trying to grow gardenias, hydrangeas, and things like that in our desert soils, because they need an acidic pH below 7. Pardon me. So if we do need to fertilize, we want to apply that fertilizer usually kind of at the start of the growing cycle of our plants. For most of them, that would be in the spring. Now, for plants, especially if they are frost tender, we want to avoid fertilizing late in the summer or at any time during the fall, because that application could initiate new vegetative growth that would be even more sensitive to a freeze. Pardon me. So that is what I hope was a good overall introduction to successfully having a water efficient landscape here in our desert environment. And as I said, there are so many things, you have irrigation workshops that are available that will go into more detail on how to approach watering. And you'll have other workshops or the videos available on pruning and those other important aspects. But hopefully this gave you kind of a condensed look at approaches, best approaches to having a beautiful landscape that's water efficient here in our valley environment.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. Everyone give Kirti a round of applause virtually. Because we can't see you all, but I know we all enjoyed the presentation and this great overview. Again, like she mentioned, we have the sustainability playlist that goes into deeper dives into specific topics, and we have a lot of classes still to go on this coming spring, so be sure to check those out. And so, of course, we want to make sure that we're going to end on time, but we do have a couple questions that were submitted.
And I have a question first. Do you want me to stop sharing? Did you want to pop something else up here?
I don't have any slides, so we can keep your slide, or we can exit out too. So the first question is, someone had mentioned that they got rid of grass and they've mulched with finely shredded wood, and they're looking for a larger mulch to cover it. They're thinking 2 to 3 inches of shredded wood, not bark, for a little bit more interest. Do you have any suggestions as to where I could find this? I haven't found a company that sells it, and I don't need as much as you get from Chip Drop.
Oh, you don't need that much. Do you have any friends? You could always have, I think you could always have a load of fresh chipped material from an arborist from a landscape company, and just have your friends come over, with their garbage cans or their pickup truck and share it with you. But that is one of the best things to use. And especially the fresh chipped material is the best. It will provide for a longer period of time that ecosystem for the microorganisms. And also it's with the larger pieces, it's going to kind of, when you just, lightly tamp it down, it will lock so it won't so easily blow away, but also it does stay looser to allow good air penetration still to the soil. And that is actually even better than having more finely decomposed or composted material as your overall mulch for a landscape. And it's ideal to use around trees. So we didn't even touch on planting, but when we plant desert plants, we do not want to amend the backfill soil at all with compost. What comes out of that hole is what should go back in to fill the space that is around the plant that you've installed. But having that top mulch, if it's organic, is the best.
It looked like Cassie said she even tried her arborist and they couldn't come up with anything, and she even tried other companies. Well, Cassie, maybe there's some people here attending tonight that might go in with you on some mulch there.
Yeah, and if you're driving around someplace and you see, a tree company at work, they've got that shredder, on the back of, the equipment that shoots the chipped material into their truck, just, stop and say, hey, would you mind dumping your load at such and such a location? And very often it's beneficial for them. Some of them, bigger companies, they might take it back to their company yard and process it as compost, maybe to use in their growing medium or something. But a lot of them have to take that to the landfill. And if they can save time and expense of going to the landfill, they will be happy.
Thank you. Okay, there was another question that was entered in the chat. So someone asked if they transplant a container that's growing a mesquite or Palo Verde, is it very unlikely to develop a taproot system?
Yes. Basically, you only get that really good, true, very vigorous and strong taproot if that plant starts from seed right where it's to grow. It's virtually impossible to get a true, fully developing taproot from a containerized tree.
Perfect. There's another question. Why is tree seal used on Palo Verde in front of the Desert Botanical Garden?
Whoa, are you serious? That's a new one. Generally, you do not want to seal any pruning cuts. They have found, the scientists and the arborists, they've found that you are more likely to have problems by trapping something bad, inadvertently, unknowingly trapping something bad in that cut rather than just leaving it open to the air. If you are making your pruning cut, and I mean, literally, I just breezed through that. If you're making your pruning cut properly, where you cut from the branch bark ridge, the branch bark collar to the ridge, if you've angled that cut perfectly, the tissue will start to seal over that wound, that cut, and within a few years, it will seal it off, and especially if it's a smaller cut. And that's the best approach.
Thank you. All right, so there was another question about what can you do to get rid of or minimize caliche?
Do you have a license to use explosives? No. Caliche, if you're fortunate, caliche might be just a very thin layer More often it's an impenetrable, deep layer. When you're planting, if you do come across caliche, you always outside, away from the root ball of your plant, especially a tree, you want to try to create a chimney poking through it to allow some drainage, even though it'll be slow. But pardon me, just breaking through that is really, there's no magic, treatment to it short of sulfuric acid that would gradually weaken it. So pickaxe, jackhammer. I'm sorry, I'm not of any help, am I?
Okay, let's do one more question. Again, sorry if we're not able to get your question tonight. Again, feel free to email myself or Joanne and we'll connect with you. Again, we have our YouTube videos too, if there's a more of a specific topic that you're trying to look into. So this last question that I'll ask for tonight, just to wrap things up, is Susan had a question. She says that she has a 20-year-old podocarpus that has yellowing leaves, and every spring she applied chelated iron, but the last few years it hasn't seemed to help. An arborist looked at it and said the soil is probably locked up, so the plant cannot take up any soil amendments that is applied. I've added garden soil and thick organic mulch. How long does it take to see improvement or know if the plant should be replaced?
Okay, your use of chelated iron is probably your best approach, or that with some soil sulfur. Neither of those is going to be any kind of a long-term fix. You would need to be incorporating those materials at least annually. Probably better would be even twice a year. So I don't know if you've looked at having a soil test from around the plant that might shed a little bit more light on the situation. But that's the only thing else I could recommend.
Thank you. Okay, well, just to have some closing remarks, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Kirti, for again a great presentation, so much helpful information. I do want to plug that we do have a class coming up on Wednesday, March 2nd from 6 to 7:30, so the same time as this class. And it'll be DIY irrigation maintenance, troubleshoot, and repair. So again, if you want to get more into that irrigation sector, be sure to attend that class. And for those of who might have joined us later, you will all receive a follow-up email that will include the PowerPoint, a recording, and a link to the survey. Again, if you complete the survey by Monday, you'll be entered in for a chance to win a free gift card from a local nursery. So I just want to thank everybody so much for being able to attend tonight and to join us. It was such a pleasure, and we're looking forward to having our next class.